Hello.
Let me just check the audio levels here. Can you speak again, please?
Again, please.
There we go.
Again and again and again. Over and over.
Wait, where's Econoboi?
Not here, you know. He's just flaking out. You don't have your socialist defense.
Oh shit.
Your walls have been toppled. The basilica has smashed them.
Wait, I'm gonna go over to his YouTube and yell at him.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Econoboi, it's
real
time.
talk. Yaron Brook retweets
Okay,
too
so I
much
guess
shit.
while we wait for him to show up, you might as well introduce yourself to my chat.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I am Scott from Fabian Liberty. We are a duo stream of anarcho-capitalists. We do some occasional philosophy. We do some occasional journalism. And I would define journalism as like actually reporting things that other people haven't reported, and digging deeper into the story. So we do that occasionally. We'll look into like finances of like some big culture thing. You know, for example, you remember that like sex camp for kids in West Virginia? We went through the finances and like proved that COVID relief money and your tax dollars were actually funding that in part.
Well, not my tax dollars. I'm Canadian, but yeah.
Not literally your tax dollars, but your as in the audience that is primarily American, I'm sure. You know, so we do a little bit of that. I do a lot of debates. Where, you know, which is probably how most people know me in Twitch politics. It's from like doing Hippy Dippy a bunch and Prime Kais and the Crucible and these places where I'm a little bit more, say ornery, blood sportsy. So most people don't get to see my nicer side. But yeah, so that's kind of what we do. So as an ANCAP, I am kind of the final boss, the secret boss you unlock after beating the game of libertarianism.
Okay, and I get it. And hello, Econoboi, you're here?
I am here. I'm here.
And my audience knows you very well, Econoboi, at this point.
I'm famous.
You are the socialist cuck who's not actually a socialist.
It's true.
I don't know, man. I feel like Yaron Brook took you to task on that. You're not a capitalist over and over again.
Well, fucking Yaron Brook's definition of capitalism is, I mean, look, people said I misrepresented his view. He said my definition of capitalism is when the government doesn't do economic stuff. Okay, now if your definition of capitalism is that, I suppose I'm not a capitalist, but that's quite a narrow definition of capitalism, if you ask me.
Yeah, it's pretty narrow. So this is something that I've noticed actually is was it Robert Conquest? I think it was Robert Conquest. He said people are conservative about the things that they know. Is that the quote? You guys know this?
No,
I don't know. I'm not well read.
Let me see.
I have my own definition of capitalism that I use, which obviously you wouldn't fit, but you know, because everyone kind of has a different definition. But the definition I use that I wrote is the ownership of private goods, the ownership of which is determined by homesteading and voluntary transactions, where the distribution of commodities, price, and production are determined by a competitive free market. So I think government and state intervention is not really capitalism per se, but a mixed economy. You know, and I think it's weird that we kind of paint this broad brush of capitalism, despite it not being how any like Adam West wouldn't have fucking defined it that way. And, you know, anybody that's like hardcore capitalist or free market wouldn't define it that way either. But, you know, I think it's fair to use a colloquial definition sometimes to like be good faith to you, right? And not be like, you're not a capitalist because you don't meet my ideology's definition of capitalism, but you don't.
Right, yeah. So I did look it up. It's everyone is conservative about what they know best. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty true if you look at it. Like if you talk to a socialist, you know, and let's say you talk to a libertarian socialist, right? They're going to say that the Soviet Union wasn't real socialism, obviously.
Right.
Because they have a very strict definition because that's what they value, yet they will paint their opponents with the widest possible brush. And that seems to be something that everyone does.
I think the biggest problem with socialism is that there's multiple definitions of socialism, not just like from all of the subcategories and intellectuals that want to like create a very specific definition, but even in the broad sense, there's really kind of like three uses of socialism as I see fit. Like you have the original, which is against the monarchy and against landed gentry, right? Before Karl Marx comes around, before Stalin kind of like captures the word socialism, right? Then you have the socialism that is like the state owns the means of production, right? As a means of kind of like distributing that, so state centralized economy, central authority, no capitalism, but you could have markets. And then you kind of have like this newer colloquial form of socialism, which is, heavy intervention and regulation of a capitalist market by the state and wealth redistribution, right? And so like you're really working with like three definitions. The first, which the original definition has kind of fallen away, but so like in the lexicon, like two definitions, and then all of the subcategories of those. And like it becomes this weird word game where like nobody really knows what the fuck you're talking about when you call someone a socialist.
Yeah, I definitely seen that. So Econoboi, you are well known among my audience, and I'm pretty sure the audience knows who I am at this point, right?
I think so. Yeah, actually, when I started streaming, I had a few members of my audience say, "Yeah, SFO, fucking, let's do it." And so I was like, "Oh, okay."
Wait, is that like they want you to destroy me, or is they just happy to see me? Like, what's the context
I
here?
think they just like you, Dev. They're just fans
nice.
of you.
Oh, that'd be nice. And I know that you two have spoken before several times, right?
Twice, I think.
Twice. Okay.
I mean, like twice in like a long capacity. I mean, I think we've chit chatted occasionally.
Okay. All right.
Sure.
So I guess for the sake of your audience, Fabian Literary, because you're streaming right now, right?
Yeah, I'm streaming on Twitch.
Okay. Yeah. So for the sake of your audience, I'm a very boring kind of half liberal, half conservative centrist. My politics are just very normie. And I'm not much of a debater. I'm more of like a video essayist.
Yes.
Guy. I'm that part of you.
I feel like my audience actually knows you fairly well. I've reacted to like one or two of your videos. I think the Why the Left Hates Farmers was one of them because we were definitely like digging into the situation in the Netherlands and kind of the nitrogen issue and all of that stuff. You're kind of like you're known to my audience as a fence sitter, but like you're a fence sitter enough in such a way that it's like unoffensive. You know what I mean? Like most fence sitters don't pull it off very well. I think you do.
Oh, well, thank you. I mean, I've never liked the fence sitter term, but I guess it really is. That's really what I am in the end. The hard part about being a centrist is like being a centrist doesn't mean that you're the neutral aliens from Futurama where you have no opinion on anything. It means that sometimes you think the left is correct and sometimes you think the right is correct.
Right.
It's going to depend on the situation.
But from my perspective, it's like all three of you are all just statists, and that's really the bigger problem, right?
Wait, all three of us?
The left, the right, and the center.
Oh, okay. Okay, right.
Right.
Yeah. So the reason that this stream came about is because Econoboi, I had you on my podcast with Lilith, because somebody had paid me to watch an ANCAP video with you since you're economically literate and I'm not. So we watched that, and that was
they were very insistent on watching the video.
They were very insistent, and Fabian, you showed up, and you said, "Wait, this is a terrible representation of the ANCAP position."
No. I did not. Okay, what happened is people from my audience showed up to your stream, and were upset about it. I haven't even watched the video you guys reacted to because I want to just give like. I don't want to go into this immediately being like, let's attack what was said. I'd rather just kind of start fresh.
Yep.
But then I showed up and people were like, yo, they're like talking about ANCAP. And I was like, well, like if you guys want to talk about ANCAP stuff, talk to an ANCAP.
Right. So, Econoboi, how much ANCAP theory have you read? We should start there first. How literate are we on this topic?
Read? I don't know if I've really read much of any theory, but I've watched a number of lectures on it, and obviously I've had a number of discussions on it.
Okay.
So I don't know. I'd give myself compared to an average person on the street, I'd give myself a 7 or 8 out of 10 on the anarchism theory scale.
No, I'd give you a 2, and I'd give the average person a 0.
Ouch.
Wait, you think no, but that's not how averages work. The average person is going to be a 5, right? So the average person is a 5, and then I would certainly give myself above an average on the anarchism theory knowledge.
Yeah. If you want to use that as your reference point, I would say like 10 being full knowledge of everything written and 0 being none. Right. I would say the average person averages to 0, and you might be at a 2.
Well, I guess we'll get into it, but I oftentimes when I talk to anarchists or when I talk to, I often use MMTers as an example of this. There's oftentimes they, oh, well, you don't understand what anarchism is. You don't understand what MMT is. You don't understand what a socialism is. And it's like, well, how about you explain what I don't understand? And then it turns out, it turns out I already knew all that stuff. That's oftentimes how the conversations go.
I mean, we've had some basic conversations, but like there's a lot of deep, like anarchism is, like Dave Smith likes to say, and I'm allowed to say it because I have an autistic son. Our greatest weapon as ANCAPs is weaponized autism. So like off stream, like we have 2 hour long conversations about like the theory of a bundle of sticks and whether or not one can sell a portion of reputation in a store as a means of creating a marketplace system of IP, right? Like there's like really deep theory that is like only for the hardcore nerds that like doesn't even fucking matter really, but it just kind of interests us.
So are these the conversations you have when you're like getting high? So is that
I don't, since joining the army, I don't really smoke pot or anything.
Oh, okay.
I'm pretty straight edge. Occasionally I have a drink, but yeah.
Because there's that stereotype that a lot of libertarians like getting high and talking about the state.
I mean, like that's certainly a thing.
Like that,
that's certainly a thing. Well, the biggest distinction I think that's misunderstood about libertarianism is you really have 2 types of libertarians, right? You have big L and little L. Right. So little L libertarian is, I don't like how big the government is. I don't like how much they intrude upon my life. I don't like how, Christian conservatives are trying to like regulate my body or like my music and things like that. I don't like how the left is trying to tax the shit out of me, et cetera, et cetera. I want limited government. I want the government out of my life. Right. And then big L libertarian are people that are based in libertarian philosophy. They believe in the non-aggression principle. They believe in, Rothbardian natural law, and like they read Hoppe and covenant communities and things like that. And these would be your ANCAPs and like your minarchists. And the Mises Caucus has recently taken over the Libertarian Party, and the Mises Caucus is a lot more big L libertarian with some paleo libs. And the old Libertarian Party was like kind of little L libertarian, left-leaning libertarianism.
Right. So, for example, my co-host on my podcast is a little L libertarian for sure. Mm-hmm. She's very much like I just want to get high and be left alone kind of thing.
I think that's a natural thing for people. Yeah. I think people's intuition is like, just leave me the fuck alone and let me live my life.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That seems to be a very normal, like I meet people who are apolitical. They don't follow politics. They don't even know what politics they are. But they're like, you can just leave me alone. Let me do my own thing. I think that's a very normal way to view things. As for me, I think I'm actually very uneducated on what the ANCAPs want. But I have been doing some reading in the past year.
Nice.
So you said the way to pronounce the name is Hoppe, not Hop. I always say it Hop.
It's Hoppe unless you're watching Dr. Walter Block and he'll say Hoppy, but that's mostly because he knows Hoppe and he likes to fuck with him.
Oh, okay.
Which makes it even more confusing because Dr. Walter Block is like a huge name in anarcho-capitalism. And so people will come in and be like Hoppy, and it's like, that's not how you say his name, but it's German. Right. It's Hoppe.
So recently I've been diving into like the broader like neo-reactionary wing of politics because I haven't really encountered any of that before up until about a year ago. Mm-hmm. So I started reading some stuff in there, and I know the ANCAPs are kind of liked, and at least some ANCAP stuff is liked over there. So I've read A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism.
That's a good one.
And I'm just getting through. I'm like the first few pages into Democracy: The God That Failed.
Yes, Democracy: The God That Failed is definitely the one book that Hoppe did that is loved by like the kind of like the, I guess you could call them the if that's the terminology you want to use, I'll accept it. That's fine. The neo-reactionary right? Because it lays out a lot of pro-monarchist arguments.
Yeah, and a lot of the neo-reactionaries, they're more pro-monarchist than they are ANCAP. So, but yeah, and I ended up putting it down because I switched focus to do Gramsci's prison notebooks, because I'm doing a video on that in the next month or so, because I think they're actually pretty important to all the bullshit we've been seeing right now on the left. So I kind of forgot about my dive into the ANCAP literature. So basically, the reason that I wanted to do this conversation is because we were talking about ANCAP stuff, because I wanted to get a bit more educated on it. Yeah, I'll just say right now, I'm probably never going to be an ANCAP. I'm pretty set in my political positions, but I do like to understand things that I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm basically here to hear from both an ANCAP and someone who's like an anti-ANCAP about what being an ANCAP is.
Yeah, no, I mean that's fine. I mean, like where would you want to start? Like I mean, like I could go in and like preach on a soapbox, but I feel like this conversation is much better answering questions to the best of my ability and extrapolating and maybe like dispelling some ideas in that process.
Okay. Actually, I have an idea. Can you just give me a minute?
60 seconds on the clock. Go.
Yes. You two talk amongst yourselves, and I will be back in 60 seconds. Okay.
Okay.
Oh shit.
He's doing? My goodness.
Oh God, no. He's got a notebook ready. How you been, Econoboi?
Oh, I'm doing okay. I've been sick, but I'm getting over it slowly and just hanging out, really. Nothing too much. Bought a grill recently. Started grilling things like every man does.
Oh yeah. And, the midlife crisis is never complete without beginning to grill.
Well, you've got to get started smoking and grilling. So that's how it starts. And
right.
Hopefully that's where it finishes. I can't think of any other kitchen, cooking appliances I need. I'm a somewhat of a cook, so I think I've really decked out my kitchen as best as a person can.
I live in an apartment complex. I wish I could grill. I had to give up my grill when I moved here. I gave it to my mom. I was so upset.
You don't have like a balcony or something you can grill on?
What? That's such a fire hazard. Like, what are you talking about?
What, grilling on your fucking balcony? What's
yeah, you cannot do that, Econoboi. That's not okay.
Bro, come on. I've grilled it in apartments and shit. Who cares? Doesn't matter.
Oh shit, nah, man. That's no bueno. I mean, I got
grill inside.
You know what you could do? You could get one of those. I think I don't even know if they're available in North America. They're available in India for sure. They're a grill that you can get that attach to your window like a garden box, so they hang outside. You can just grill out your window.
That sounds like more of a fire hazard.
That sounds like some shit you'd see in like those like fucking like 300 square foot apartments that all the Chinese live in that are like working in slavery in your factories to make all your wonderful products. Like that sounds like some shit they would have for sure, because there's like no room for them to do anything anywhere.
Right. Okay. So I guess you mentioned earlier what an ANCAP was. Could you repeat that if you don't mind?
Well, no, that was my definition of capitalism. I think.
Okay. So yeah, what's an ANCAP then?
Right. So I think first and foremost, an ANCAP is an anarchist, right? Following in the vein of the anarcho-individualists, such as Proudhon. Well, not Proudhon, he was a mutualist, but following in some of the theory of Proudhon, Josiah Warren, Benjamin Tucker, Batchelder Green, Voltaire and de Cleyre, like those early contemporaries of Proudhon, that didn't take the anti-capitalist route historically, that after Sade was murdered by the left-wing anarchists, and after anarcho-individualists were kind of pushed out of the Black International and the Second International, right? So historically, that kind of occurred, and anarchism took this anti-capitalist bent. But the original ideas of anarchism were against statism, right? They were against the rule. They were against the landed gentry. They were against, those kind of things. And so Rothbard kind of like rediscovers Benjamin Tucker. His writings for Liberty Magazine were almost lost completely to the world in a fire in New York. and rediscovers, no treason. I'm sorry. What is it? It doesn't matter. Spooner's, Lysander Spooner's documents and things like that. And he also, takes this other thing, which is Austrian economic theory from Mises and Say, and, a lot of, and Minga and like all these other, 19th and, earliest 20th century economists, and kind of marries those two. And so what an ANCAP is against the state, an anarchist, the dissolution of the state, voluntary association in every regard. And then you kind of add on that pro-capitalism thing, which is instead of being anti-capitalist, you believe in the idea that there's no inherent exploitation between two people voluntarily trading things, and you believe in private property, unlike most anarchists that believe in like this idea of like personal property and then like common property or public property. Definitionally, like we could give you a kind of an academic definition. I have a working one here, but it's kind of boring, right? I think you kind of get the point by what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think I get the point. Yeah, I've heard from a lot of like libertarian socialists and anarcho-communists, people like that. They say that rightist anarchists aren't really anarchists, and I think the reason they give is because they're not prepared to stand up to the inherent hierarchy that is capitalism.
Yeah, so the thing is that hierarchical structure was never a part of anarchism from Proudhon, even from Bakunin, from any of the early anarchists, right? What happened though is that anarcho-individualism faded as people like Kropotkin, people like Malatesta, anarcho-communists, right, started coming in. And then in 1972, which is, roughly 20 years after anarcho-capitalism was invented by Rothbard, you have Noam Chomsky coming up with this new definition, which is, that they're against unjustified hierarchies, right? That the hierarchies need to be justified, and that they don't believe that capitalism fits that justification. And then in the last 20 years or so, this has become simply any hierarchies existing at all. Everything must be hierarchically kind of organized. The issue that I have with that is that I think it goes against the nature of reality. The idea that I think that like so long as
I agree.
Yeah, so long as humans value things and humans differ in their ability to produce things, there will always be a hierarchy, right? Like if one person's really good at something and one person's really bad and people like things, they're going to create a hierarchical structure based around competency of that person's ability to do so. And even in hierarchical societies, you end up with a council of elders that are better, and so they kind of put in stopgaps in their structures to try and combat what is essentially human nature. And to me, from a Piagetian like kind of game theory perspective, that doesn't work because it attributes a certain cost and eventually fails.
I'm not sure if
I don't know if left anarchists would. I feel like we're getting away from the definition we mentioned, right? Left anarchists, I'm not sure, would say that there shouldn't be any hierarchy. It's more how you justify the hierarchy, right? What's the accountability of the people in positions of power? How do they get there in the first place? What are ultimately their duties? I mean, when you look at the structures of like anarchist international movements, they were hierarchical, right? They had councils, like you described, right? So
yeah,
I'm not
it's
sure
human nature to have those hierarchies. Yeah. I
Right.
agree that some would say that, right? But the problem that I have goes deeper than that, which I don't know if we really want to get into that. But the real issue that I have is the philosophy that undergirds left anarchism is, for the most part, Hegelian Marxist, inspired. And the philosophy that undergirds anarcho-capitalism is individualist Enlightenment liberalism taken to its extreme. And so even though we're very similar in being anti-state, the philosophy is radically different, right? Like we couldn't be more different from the philosophy, even though some of our policy prescriptions and ideas are very similar, which is, getting rid of the state. And so I think that causes a lot more issues than people realize.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I know when you say Hegelian Marxist, you're talking about very, very, very broadly speaking. Marx had that one passage where he talks about the stateless, moneyless, classless society. That seems like it would be anarchy friendly because it is stateless and moneyless and classless. So okay.
Well, when I bring that up,
how he gets there is kind of ridiculous, but
yeah, what I'm really talking about is the dialectic, right? Like the idea of like life and the world is full of contradictions. Objective truth is like not like a real, like it's early theory that leads to postmodernism, right? It's okay that the world is full of contradictions. We just need to reorganize power structures to lessen the impact of these contradictions. But antithesis, and then then we'll have the analysis, and then we'll have the synthesis, maintaining the contradictions, etc. Whereas ANCAPs are looking at the idea of like Rothbardian natural law. We're looking at it from a perspective of there is an objective truth to the reduction of conflict. And there is a system that we can follow that will reduce conflict. And the only way to have the minimal amount of conflict is by following that natural law. Respect of self-ownership and of the person and of private property rights, no theft or, taxation, for example, no coercion, and the non-aggression principle, grounded in argumentation ethics.
Right. So this is what I was preparing for that minute. Okay. So from what I understand about Rothbard is that Rothbard rejected the Lockean proviso, and the Lockean proviso was basically the idea in John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. He says something like, you create property by mixing your labor with natural stuff,
Yeah.
The example he gives is you walk out into a forest, you pick up an acorn. The action of picking it up is labor. The acorn itself is natural property, so the acorn becomes your private property. And that's how you create private property out of nature. And Locke has a caveat to this rule where he says people can do this only insofar as there is enough natural property out there for others to also be able to come along and do this.
Right.
And the example that he gives is something like if you're thirsty and you go to a stream and then you drink from the stream, even though you've taken the water and now there's less water because you've drunk it, there's still so much water that the next guy can still come along and still drink. He doesn't lose anything because you've taken some. Now,
plus, like, evaporation exists.
Right, yeah. But if you take the entire stream now you've taken so much that other people can't have anything. And so he said that there should be a limit on how much property you can claim from nature.
Right.
And from what I understand from my readings on this topic is that Rothbard rejected that limitation on the creation of property from nature. Is that people should be able to just create as much property as they want. And if it's all used up, then it's all used up.
Yep.
That's about right?
Yeah, it's pretty much right. I mean, so it gets a little bit more detailed when you look at like Hoppe, when he talks about common, public, and private property and the rationalization for private property. So there is a restriction, not so much in what can be privatized, but in determining easement rights. So for example, let's say there's a stream like you described, and there's a village nearby, and everyone uses that stream for water, and then someone builds a dam for that stream. Well, everyone that was a part of that village has a certain easement right to what was essentially partially homesteaded common property because they were all using that before. And so because they were all using that before, you have to maintain those water rights to those people in some capacity. Either you have to buy them out, you have to, give them money worth what it was that they lost, or you have to continue to give them access to the water that's available that was just made better by the dam, whatever it may be, right? So like there is easement rights that we believe exist because of the capacity to like partially homestead things by utilizing things over and over again. But you're not fully homesteading something unless you mix your labor with it and create something, right? And by doing so, you privatize that land, assuming that it wasn't owned by anybody. But yeah, but for the most part, Rothbard, yes, absolutely. But this is before Hoppe's kind of like discussion on easement rights.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seems like there'd just be a practical problem, you know, of what do you do when all the property's taken up? Because the Earth is going to be so big, right?
Well, I mean,
some issue there.
I mean, you know, hopefully, if the government stopped stealing half of all of our wealth, you know, we'd be able to get over into the stars, and you know, and there'd be more Earths. But yes, I mean, like at some point, all of the land will be owned by someone. But like, why is that a problem?
Well, because new people who are coming into the system that are new, they can't really mix their labor with nature and create new property anymore.
Well, I mean, so you can't create, you know, you can't homestead, let's say, some area in the woods and create a house and then like homestead that property, right? And so yes, the original property needs to be homesteaded, but there's no conflict or issue with the fact that like people today live in America. There's no property to homestead in America. Like what you're describing for the Americans and for Canadians already exists today. There's no issue that you can't go out and into the middle of the woods and then just, you know, build a house and say, this is my land now, but you still have property. And the reason that you have property is because even though that land is homesteaded, you know, the economy continues, people produce other things. They can still homestead, for example, you know, natural resources that they purchased from somebody else, create some artwork, create some functional widget, whatever it may be. And they've mixed their labor with that, and that is their private property. And then they gain money for goods and services, and they can purchase private property from other private property owners. Like what we're talking about is the initial rule that creates private property, as opposed to like a utopic world where everyone can conceivably go out into the woods and homestead some property.
Okay. I think I understand. So I have posed this question to anarcho-capitalists several times over the past year. And every single time, I don't really get a satisfactory answer. I just get told that I'm stupid and I don't understand.
Well, I won't tell you that you're stupid and you don't understand. I will do my best to answer the question, but like, you know, there are smarter people than me.
Fabian's the final boss in anarcho-capitalism.
No, I am not. No, I am not. Like Dr. Walter Block or Hoppe or somebody like that is
in the online politics world, though. Fabian, you're the final boss. You know.
Right.
If you can't handle the question, no one can.
Liquid Zulu knows his theory better than I do, but he's difficult to talk to.
So,
what's this question, Dev?
Okay. Firstly, the main reason that I get so much pushback is because the NCAPs that I were talking to, there was like a personal spat between like them and like the Sargon crowd of the internet, and I'm friends with Sargon, so there was like
I love Sargon. Yo, Sargon fucking started me down my fucking my like anti-socialist, anti-communist rabbit hole.
Were you a socialist back in the day?
Yeah, I was a full-blown well, I wouldn't say I was a full-blown. I was more like a sock dim leaning more socialist. Okay. Back in the day.
Well, when I was 19, I was like almost a tanky, so we all change as we get older, you know?
Yeah.
That's just how it is. But okay. So I pose this question and I usually get laughed at and they just tell me I don't understand. And it's very possible that I don't understand. So I'm open to that possibility that I just don't get it and I need some things explained to me and I'm just dumb, okay? But this is like my equivalent of Vosh's Coconut Island, okay?
Okay.
It's a ridiculous situation that probably won't happen, but it pushes the ethics of this school of thought to possibly a break.
I understand why people got mad at you, because your analogy may just be dismissible because it doesn't match with reality, but I'll attempt to do it in good faith.
Okay. I'm gonna put it up on the screen. And by the way, I'm not asking this as a gotcha. I really want to know what the answer is. Okay. I'm gonna put it up on the screen.
Oh, which screen?
To you in the
just share screen with me.
Yeah. I'll put it in the Discord chat.
Okay.
So it's a very simple MS Paint drawing. Okay. And people who watch my Twitter know what this is. Know what this symbol is. Okay.
Oh, okay. I know this question. This will be a fun one. I can tell already.
Yeah. You know what's going on here?
Yeah, you have 4 property owners that have enclosed another property owner.
No, not specifically. That's close, but no. What's going on here is you have a person who is adventuring through unclaimed property. He has no intention to actually claim any. He's just backpacking and hiking through, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he sets up his camp for the night. He doesn't claim the property that he's camping on. He just plans to camp overnight and then get up the next day and leave. Overnight, the edge of civilization catches up with him, and you have 4 people who build their farms, and they set up fences and they start working the land, and they say, well, this is our private property now. So I don't care what you do, but you can't trespass on my land. And then he finds himself boxed in.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be a problem that relying solely on private property rights would be natural.
Yeah, no. So it's not I'm glad. So first of all, so there's no easement rights because this person is just like a random backpacker. So there's this thing in anarcho-capitalist philosophy called the gentleness principle, right? And the gentleness principle is that like you need to rationally like for example, when you're defending yourself, right? So let's say you're on your land, right? And in today's world, right? You're on your land, you happen to have a gun on your hip, right? And an old woman with dementia wanders onto your property. Are you obliged to help her? Well, not particularly, but can you pull out your gun and unload as many rounds as possible as you can onto this old woman with dementia that like happened to stumble just barely across your property line? No, you're going to go to jail for murder, right? Despite the fact that she trespassed on your property. Well, the same kind of thing applies here, right? The gentleness principle. If for whatever reason, this magic scenario where a camper is living in camp and somehow 4 pieces of private property are, like built around you and you're trapped and like you don't have any easement rights, right? You know what I mean? Like no easement rights existed.
You could use like a parachuter as if someone parachutes from a plane and happens to land like in an enclosed.
Right. Like whatever it may be, like, yes, this person is a trespasser, but you have to follow the gentleness principle, right? So for example, when we talk about, our definition of abortion, right? We believe in evictionism because we don't believe that abortion can be done. We don't think that you can dismember and kill a baby and like that be your right. But a woman still has a right to her body, and therefore she has a right to evict the baby from her body, right? So she's following the gentleness principle here.
This is I heard that in Star Trek Deep Space Nine.
Did you really?
Yeah. So the the Ferengi, right? Like the capitalist race.
No, I don't. Every time I ever tried to watch Star Trek, it just kind of seemed like mid-wit communist philosophy thrown into like a crappy sci-fi show. So like it seemed like utter shit to me. Sorry to all the Trekkies. I think it's dumb.
By the time of DS9, there's a race introduced called the Ferengi, and they are basically the anarcho-capitalist race because they have a government, but the government is like their financial leader and stuff like that. Everything's based on capitalism and money and trade and who they have like their religion is based on money. Like it's insanity, right? But one of the Ferengis says that pregnancy is considered a rental in their society. So the woman charges rent for 9 months, and I just thought that was fucking hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about all that, right? But so that's kind of the same thing, right? So the gentleness principle applies. Is the person a trespasser for trespassing on that property, assuming this magic scenario where they were enclosed overnight, which like wouldn't occur, right? And would be weird. Do they have a right to trespass? Well, no, they don't have a right to trespass. But you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, obviously. If they do trespass as a means of leaving, there's kind of like no court in the world, no rights enforcement agency that would in some way, shape, or form like punish this person for trespassing. And the gentleness principle of like eviction from your property would have to be followed, which would be a simple of like, hey, what are you doing? And then him being like, dude, you built property around me, I'm just passing through. And they'll be like, okay, pass through. It's like, it's kind of a non-issue that like you try and bring up as an issue because the theory seems to have like this real world situation where like conflict is required, right? Which is that trespassing is required. But again, there's no easement. There's also the fact that like you can homestead air property, but I doubt they homesteaded it. You can they could dig under, right? Like all of these are kind of silly, ridiculous examples, but again, this isn't really a real world scenario that like would have issues.
Okay, no, I understand. See, that is definitely more of an answer that I got, other than just "you are dumb," because I don't think it's a dumb question. I think it's a question that'll never happen. But I think every ideology has these points where, like, okay, the principles are tested kind of at the extreme, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, and there is an answer there, which I think is the gentleness principle, which is, you don't have a right to just like shoot somebody when you built them and enclose them in. Also, the very act of enclosing is in such a way that a person is denied their ability to pass through in any capacity, could easily be seen as a form of aggression. But that would be kind of something you might need a common law marketplace under rights enforcement agencies to determine the value and like whether or not that is a form of aggression and how to work it in that specific example.
Right, because just the
it's kind of a form of kidnapping, right? Like the person's asleep and then they're enclosed by private property and then they're denied access to leave. Like, how is that any different than bringing someone onto your private property and saying they can't leave?
Well, I think the difference is that I put up 4 plots by 4 different people and not just one guy who built around them. I think it's
I mean, you communally and unintentionally kidnapped someone. How do you resolve this issue? You let the person go.
Right. Yeah. See, that does seem to suggest, though, that there is, at the very least, some limit on the ownership of private property in this system, because you have to let people pass through. You have to in this situation. So you can't just be like, no trespassing under no circumstances. There has to be some circumstance by which people can trespass.
So like not like ultimate autonomy over your land, I guess, is what you're.
No, I would say you still have ultimate autonomy. So let's say all 4 people vehemently disagree with the individual crossing their private property, and they're forced to make this person a criminal and criminally trespass. Right. Again, this doesn't go against the gentleness principle, right? Because the individual in question is a self-owner. Their body is their property as well, right? And so what you've done is you've committed an act of aggression by enclosing them overnight and kidnapping them without giving them any recourse to be able to adequately move around you, right? So it's not like, this person was sitting there for months and refused to leave or anything like that, right? And even if that was the case, then they would have some easement rights to the common property that they had, which is the path that they took, to wherever they were in and out of their land, etc. Right? So no, I don't think it says that a person doesn't have ultimate kind of like say of their private property. What it says is that you don't get to execute people or harm people or become aggressors against people because they are individual owners of their bodies, of themselves.
Right. But this principle wouldn't apply, for example, if you have, your house and there's still a road or whatever. There's still a place where a person could walk. And this guy's like, I'm going to cut through your yard because it's a shorter walk for me. And you're like, no, you're not.
Well, in either scenario, the person's not allowed to trespass, right? But if you committed an act of aggression by intentionally kidnapping and trapping them, then yeah, they're allowed to trespass. And this is restitution for the crime that you committed by kidnapping them and forcing them into an enclosure that like doesn't give them the ability to exercise their own autonomy and agency, right? So the restitution is the ability to pass through their land to leave.
Well, what if
you were the original aggressor there?
Like, what if you just were contracted to like start building a fence or something on your land, and it happens to be the case that this person was passing through, and the contractors start building it, they build it, and then you find yourself in that situation.
Well, you can you can accidentally break the law, right? You can accidentally break. Right. You can accidentally be an aggressor against people, and you can today, you could accidentally break the law and not know you're breaking the law.
But I'm saying like you're mentioning the intentions though, but it sounds like the intentions don't matter as much because the person would still be compelled to let the person leave the enclosure.
I don't feel like I was mentioning intentions. Maybe I misspoke. But like you're an aggressor, whether intentionally so or not.
When you say aggressor, I think that kind of implies,
maybe it does colloquially, but I wouldn't say that it does in anarcho-capitalist philosophy regarding the non-aggression principle.
Yeah, I mean, I understand how you can accidentally aggress on people. I understand that. Yeah.
Right.
I wonder though, you have a situation where all four of the property owners say, "Listen, I don't care what you do. You can walk through their property if you want. You just can't walk through mine." So from their point of view, you still have a way out that doesn't involve infringing on them, but that's because all four of them are individually agreeing to do the same thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting way of looking at it, but the ultimate conclusion is that no one will let this person pass, and they kidnap this person. They're communally acting as aggressors. So he's an innocent trespasser, and and they need to follow the gentleness principle, which is to resolve the situation in a reasonable and rational way, which is to let them pass through.
Right. So if they, I guess now we're moving beyond the hypothetical into just what would happen if they did violate the gentleness principle. What's next? Like, do they?
Well, I mean, it depends, right? Because the interesting thing about anarcho-capitalism is I'm describing a theory, right? Now we're engaging in reality, and the question that has to follow up from that is, well, what is the system of government? Is it full-blown Ancapistan with rights enforcement agencies? Is it like a covenant community that has, a system of governance that they voluntarily adhere to? Is it some other voluntaristic society? Is it a communist commune where individuals voluntarily agree to associate and redistribute wealth and do whatever it is that they want in that regard, right? All of these fall under anarcho-capitalist philosophy. So I don't know the answer to that without knowing like the circumstances of the individuals living there, right?
All right, no, I completely understand. I think that is definitely the best answer I've gotten so far.
Well, I appreciate it.
Engage with the idea. Most people are just like, "You're stupid." It's like, well, okay, but I still want to know.
I mean, you have three types of ANCAPs, right? You have edgy teenagers that picked a political philosophy that they knew would piss off the most people. You have right? You have people that discovered anarcho-capitalism via their study of economics, usually found and fell in love with Austrian economic theory, and then kind of became libertarian and ANCAP through Austrian economics. And then you have the third.
Wasn't that you?
Yeah, right.
I am an ANCAP.
Yeah. You are neither an ANCAP nor a capitalist, sir. Get out of here. No, I'm kidding. And then you have the third group. The third group are kind of a rare individual like me who become libertarian, start reading the philosophy, and then are dragged kicking and screaming towards anarcho-capitalism because the arguments are just correct in by my approximation, obviously not others, but you kind of like, you become a libertarian, then you become like a minarchist, and then eventually you become an ANCAP, and it's a slow process. We're a very small percentage of ANCAPs, and I think we're the only people that know how to speak to humans.
All right, I think I know what you're talking about. So Econoboi, I know you. I've neglected you a little bit. I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Okay. What is your opinion of the ANCAP thing? Because I'm pretty sure, Fabian, I know your opinion of social democracy already. I'm pretty sure I know it. But Econoboi, what's your opinion of anarcho-capitalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said before that intellectually, I think we're all anarchists, right? I mean, the idea of well, I suppose I'm using more the left anarchist kind of label. The idea of a society that's based on ultimately pure voluntarism and consent, and I suppose because of my left leanings, I'll throw in the abolition of unjust hierarchy as well. That sounds
so anarcho-capitalism.
Well, I don't think your society would necessarily abolish unjust. I mean, we mentioned it before, right? How that's not necessarily a good definition of a good inclusion of a definition of cap.
Oh no, I would just simply say that if they're purely voluntary, then they are justified hierarchies.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I guess it's more transitive. But yeah, but I mean, anyway, that sort of society sounds great to anyone, right? I mean, it's just a matter of, number one, does human nature really allow that? Number two, does it work in practice given whatever your philosophical predispositions are? And what is the transition from a currently stated society to an anarchist society look like? And to me, the sort of responses to those issues are that I'm not sure it works based on human nature. I'm not sure that it would work based on my philosophical predispositions on maybe an individual or even a societal level. I'd have to tease it out more. And I just, in terms of the transition, I mean, the transition is something that I think a lot of anarchists have struggled with talking about, because anarchists, I want to say Fabian falls into this bucket. A lot of anarchists are sort of ultimately skeptical of like the current systems that we have, obviously, but when it comes to changing the system, it seems like the methods that you'd have to utilize would be, at least in our system, would be electoralism. In like China, it might be infiltrating the governing party and elites and stuff like that. And so, how do you change a system with which you're ultimately skeptical of even interacting with? It seems like quite a difficult question. A lot of anarchists would just say, I'm obviously relying more on left anarchists in this regard. A lot of anarchists would say, we should develop a more mutualist society and develop sort of independent frameworks for extending services and helping people, and that'll lead to more communes and things like that, and hopefully that just sort of bellows out from there. But I'm not really sure how realistic that is. So
I'm actually really glad that you brought up that point, because the channel's name is Fabian Liberty. I stole it from the Fabian Society, right? Who got it from Fabius the general, the first Roman general that defeated Hannibal, right? Because Hannibal came in with this massive army. How are we going to stop it? And so they used hit and run tactics and burned all of the farmland on their way out, and basically starved Hannibal because he had to resupply through the Swiss Alps. And so the Fabian Society wanted socialism. And they knew that socialism and communism were considered by anyone with half a brain to be, pure fucking evil and destructive and awful and ineffective.
Sure.
Right. And so they were like, well, how do we do this? So they set up a coat of arms, right, which was a wolf in sheep's clothing. They kind of almost weirdly recognized the evil of socialism and the welfare state and things like that. But what they knew was that you can't sell socialism, but you can sell slightly more wealth redistribution. You can sell a little bit more regulated market to stop the evils of market failures, right? You can sell, a little bit of a welfare system incrementally, and eventually you'll reach a socialist state without capitalism and without, legitimate private property or anything like that, if you just kind of slowly get more and more progressive. And so our name was kind of tongue in cheek, the exact opposite. Right? Like, our strategy is not to fully, completely disengage with electoralism, but I mean, like, I'm a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party and a supporter of the Mises Caucus. I have issues with them, obviously. The idea here is to kind of like plant the seeds for trees of which, you will never sit in the shade. The idea is to slowly curtail some of that socialism, some of that state intervention, some of that, regulation that is, some of those taxes, all of those things that are so destructive to our society and to people's freedoms and liberty, until more and more people begin to realize, that the state only has a monopoly on a relatively few things, and you reduce that until we can kind of reach a minarchist state, and then believe that like anarchist communities would pop up in that regard, freely and without violence. I do not take the route of the lefty anarchists that are like, agorist or illegalism, that like want to engage in like these sorts of violence as a means of fixing it. And the other problem with the left-wing anarchists is the same problem of communism, which is they hate capitalism more than they hate the state. And so their answer to almost everything is to give the state more power, and then eventually we'll solve the problem of statism. Like, we need social health care. We need, government programs and regulation to stop big business and things like that, when the answer is we need to get the government's power out of those things. So I would say that we're radically different in the way that we approach things than the left-wing anarchists that are, essentially communists, most of them. Once you really start to pick them down, their ideology, and attack it far enough, you'll realize that their philosophy is barely different than communist philosophy. It's just they've coached it in anarchism.
Well, sure. I mean, if communism is a classless, stateless society, of course we can. I mean, a lot of people think anarcho-capitalism is like a tautology, right? It's like, well, it's the same thing, right? So at least I've heard that argument a lot.
Right, but the problem is how do you get there, right? And in communism, the answer is, socialism, and the state will, control everything until, we can reach the idea of class consciousness is raised to the masses. And then once everyone has class consciousness, all of a sudden, like the mythology that is capitalism, that requires a myth of private property, etc., will crumble because people will no longer believe in the system that is, not based in reality. And like the state can transition from low communism to high communism and kind of give up all of its power, which never fucking happens.
Well, but, I mean,
and they end up doing the same shit.
Yeah, but I think your ideology relies on a dismantling of an attitudinal barrier as well, right? I mean, I think a lot of people, if you ask them, I mean, of course you'd agree with this, right? If you ask people, do you think we should have like a stated government? I mean, I think most people would say yes, even if you described it in completely accurate sort of anarchist terminology, right? I think most people are pretty comfortable with the currently stated nature of society.
Absolutely.
So
unfortunate though it may be. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
yeah. Well,
I just don't think it's that different in that regard, right?
Well, the difference is that my philosophy is to work to limit the state's power slowly but surely. Theirs is to give the state more and more power, and then eventually they'll end up in a stateless society once the state has all the power. It doesn't make any fucking sense.
No, I get what you're saying, but all really that I'm saying is that it's a matter of how do we, from an anarchist perspective, how do we dismantle that sort of fundamental cultural attitudinal barrier to the society that we currently live in? Because obviously, if I go out and describe leftist anarchism, or I don't want to say right-wing anarchism, but like anarcho-capitalism to regular people, 99% of people are going to be like, yeah, that's fucking crazy. And they're going to ask like similar questions that you might end up getting pigeonholed into in a lot of debates. Like, what about police? How do I like own my house? What about like, what if my employer is a dickhead? Like, how do I appeal to external entities when, a lack of justice is occurring? And those are questions that ultimately I think well-read anarchists have answers for. But
yeah, of course I do.
Most people are not prepared to have like a 7-hour discussion on that kind of thing, right?
Well, so most people aren't prepared.
The barrier is pretty massive.
Yeah, I mean, most people aren't prepared to have conversations at a high level on anything. I'm not prepared to have conversations at a high level on, let's say, certain like chemistry, right? Like I'm not prepared to have a conversation at a high level on chemistry. I need you to speak to me like I'm in elementary school. But that doesn't mean that I should like quit chemistry, or that I should quit trying to, educate people in science, or that I should hope for a society that is more educated in science so that we can better tackle our issues moving forward, and so that we can have more competent chemists in the future.
To be fair, all I'm saying is that when you point out that communists, it's almost as if they have to, they rely on using the state powers to transform society's culture and attitudes towards, an ultimate sort of communist system. My only point is that the question isn't really the changing of attitudes, because obviously that would need to occur in both systems. In your view, I think we would agree. It's just how do you do it? You're saying the communists might rely more on state power, which of course it's just going to depend on the communists that you're talking to. Whereas from your perspective, an anarchist would rely on state power, but ultimately to dismantle the state's power from within. And
there's a huge distinction, right? Because the problem.
I'm not saying there's not a huge distinction. I'm just saying that
they're not similar.
On the communists you're talking to, and from your perspective, obviously, you're still ultimately concerned about that attitudinal barrier.
Of course, I'm concerned with that, right? But the thing here is that the the left-wing anarchist position. I have heard almost no one. There's very few left-wing anarchists. Soyadal on Twitch is someone that I think does this fairly well. But even he sits halfway in between.
Soyadal?
Yeah, Your Environment Seattle. That's his name. It's actually, if you want to talk to someone about like nuclear activism and stuff, he is an expert. Like, I mean, he's an activist in that regard. Like, he's constantly in different meetings and like really good on that, really good on nuclear and stuff. Okay. But check him out. But he's a lefty through and through. They almost exclusively want the state to take these things over. And the problem with the state taking these things over is the problem with the state itself, which is that the incentive structure towards the citizens is not one towards creating the attitudinal change of self-sufficiency, individualism, or mutual aid and hierarchical structures. Instead, what it is giving that up, giving those rights up from the people and transitioning them into an authoritarian regime that is the states that we live in, even under liberal democracies. And so the more power the state has in those regards, the less likely people are to kind of pick up the slack and work together as communities, work as individuals towards solving those problems. Whereas my solution, or my let's say my attack vector, right, is to reduce state power. This creates the incentives that individuals need to work as communities, work in mutual aid, set up businesses that solve problems that were, originally patchworked with Band-Aids together by the state, or, whatever it is. It creates the very incentive structure towards anarchism. And what they do is go against the incentive structure towards anarchism. They're hoping that an ideology that I believe does not match with reality will somehow come about through, dual power theory, Leninist kind of philosophy of infiltrating, stage 3 dual power theory of infiltrating the bureaucracy with the ideology until the state can become, ideologically aware of the issues of class consciousness. I just don't see, I feel like they've tried it enough times, and I'm not sure how many hundreds of millions of people have to die before we realize that socialism and communism isn't the fucking answer.
Well, sure. I mean, I don't think anybody in this call is a socialist or a communist, right?
No.
But
well,
obviously, we're just talking about. I mean, in this regard, we're just talking about the.
From my perspective, you're kind of all a little socialist, and that's the problem. But nevertheless,
well, sure. But if we're defining like basically societies that regulate and redistribute wealth as like at least a little socialist, well, a lot of those societies haven't led to the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. So the only reason I point out that
a little socialism doesn't create gulags. A lot does.
Well, sure. I'm
little socialism does lead to a lot socialism, though, sometimes.
Sure. But I'm just saying that when we're talking about socialism, capitalism, communism, anarchism, whatever, and we reference like historical examples of like socialist states that have led to the deaths of like tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people on aggregate. Obviously, that is not what anyone is advocating for here, right? I mean, nobody here is a central planner, Marxist-Leninist or anything like that, right?
No. I would just argue that, there's a kind of obviously there are extreme examples like the USSR or China or, the Khmer Rouge or Cuba or, the list goes on, of the atrocities of communism. But the issue that I find is that many people don't realize how infected they are with the very ideology and philosophy that led to these things.
Well, I know what you're saying. I think I know the road that you're going down. But I'm not entirely convinced that social democracy, capitalism with safety nets inevitably leads to socialism. And I think even the communists back in the day knew that this wasn't the case. That's why they called them social fascists, right? Because SocDems, at the end of the day, they will try to maintain capitalism because that's the goose laying the golden egg,
Oh, for
that's
sure.
Where the money comes from to actually keep the society running that they want. So I think you could have societies that have a lot of redistribution and that will not, they still won't fall into socialism.
Well, so, I mean, we'll see. Is kind of the answer here, right? Will liberal democracies go full blown socialist? It's like we see the encroachment And the idea is hopefully we can vote hard enough to like place barriers so that it doesn't go that far. I don't have necessarily the white pill that maybe you guys do, that we can as a society come together and vote to stop these things. You know, I mean, we see the lockdowns, right? This was full-blown authoritarianism, destruction of the economy, the largest transfer of wealth, both in Canada and America, in recorded history. You know, we see like, you know, looking at the Dutch farmers situation, where, you know, central power, you know, is willing to sacrifice and starve millions of people to death, which is what will happen with the inflation rate if Canada also passes the 30% nitrogen reduction standards, as well as they go through with things in to the Dutch. Like, people are going to starve to death. Like, it's going to kill people, and it's not going to kill a few. It's going to kill millions. And so like the thing that I have with this is like, we're kind of already seeing the evidence where, you know, authoritarianism is on the rise in our liberal democracies because of the power that has been granted to the state. And it's very difficult to curtail that power. And so, sure, I mean, we can be hopeful about it. But, you know, I already have many moral issues with the state itself, obviously from my perspective. I feel like people that want to engage in these regulated economies and government power are kind of playing with fire and pretending they're not, because the current world that they're living in is full of a lot of modern conveniences.
I mean, yes, kind of, but at the same time, on the other end of the argument, I don't want to also live in a world where the drugs that I get come out of Demon Mama's bathtub, you know?
Oh, for sure, for sure.
I do like some.
That's why I'm a capitalist. That's why I'm a capitalist.
But I do like there being some minimum standard of safety for some things, you know?
Well, I mean, like, so let's look at drugs, for example, right? So the theory is what if we got rid of the regulation from the state on drugs, and like we could no longer trust where our drugs come from? And the idea is like, remember those bottles from the 1900s of like cough syrup that had like fucking, you know, heroin in them and shit like that. And you're like, I don't fucking want that. I like having my drugs regulated in such a way so that I know that they're safe. Right. But then what we can look at is we can look at example and example and example of how the FDA has killed hundreds of thousands of Americans by its policies. Right. We can look at the AIDS epidemic. We can look at how the government restricted, you know, because it was happening to black people and gays. They were and drug users. They were perfectly okay with restricting vitamins. They were perfectly okay with restricting all forms of medication that were experimental.
That's not the argument, though. To be fair, like the argument isn't.
What's mine?
Systems are perfect. No. But your argument for what we're saying isn't really accurate, right? Because I don't think either.
It's perfectly accurate.
Like, it's not, though, because I don't think.
What's inaccurate about the fact that they restricted those things and forced people on AZT?
I have to explain, right? So I don't think either of us are saying that these sort of state systems of regulation are perfect. And
I never said that.
All of us, well, you're ascribing that to us by saying that, well, look at the examples of these systems failing, right? And so nobody would say that these systems can't fail, or they don't fail, or they don't have gaps, or they're not, or they're perfect, or anything like that. I think really the question is, from your perspective, I think they're designed to fail. Sometimes it's, well, would a pure market system regulate itself better than a stated system with external regulations on markets? That's the question. So I think the defense from your perspective shouldn't be attacking a stated system. We would probably agree with all those attacks. It's, does the free market regulate itself better than a stated system? That's the question.
I feel like while I'm getting there, right, in my argumentation, and maybe I'm taking too long, I feel like I'm pretty good at debating and explaining my positions without them having to be told what they should be. But I'll skip over all of the horrible things the FDA is doing. I'll lightly touch about the fact that, you know, pharmaceutical companies pay hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. We don't really know how much, into funds for the FDA that the FDA gets to use. We can talk about how the FDA does not regulate these companies and how they do spot inspections, and that they're mostly powerless in mostly just trusting the corporations to do whatever they're supposed to do. There's regulatory capture. And the reason that these things exist, right, is, and the reason I brought up the AIDS epidemic is because under a free market, these things wouldn't occur. See, it was black markets that were saving gay people from the AIDS epidemic. It was, Dallas Buyers Club and things like that. Greedy capitalists making money that were able to get the drugs that were actually saving people's lives when the government was intentionally creating, with its monopoly on power and its monopoly on determining what drugs people can and can't take, that was exacerbating this problem so much. And so, I think a free market creates a market void, right? And that market void is, how do we regulate drugs? And then what this does is this creates an opportunity for companies in competition with each other for reputation to go into these businesses and give ratings or safety ratings and things like that. And so what this allows is, instead of the FDA, which is a monopoly, which has been bought by corporations in many capacity, and which has been shown to be anti-market and has been shown to be murderous in not allowing people to have the medication that would help them, and in increasing, like, labeling procedures. Like, insulin would be drastically cheaper if we could just buy Canadian insulin. The same thing true with EpiPens, but they're not legally allowed. And we have this patent system that is specifically held up by the FDA. And so I think the argument is, which what I was getting to, is that a free market would not only be more efficient, but it wouldn't allow for the state to have state-sanctioned genocide of people in America that have happened as early as as long ago as the 90s.
Yeah, I don't think that. Again, we're coming up with examples of, I suppose, the black market saving people or something like that. I mean, a lot of people would use marijuana as an example, right? Marijuana is illegal in many places. It was for a long time, but it helps a lot of people with, various ailments, right? But then the question isn't, does the free market work with a lot of things? Dev and I would agree with that, right? The question is entirely and solely, is a completely free and unregulated market better at regulating the quality and effects of drugs than a system with state intervention, right? We can argue on the spectrum of state intervention all day. Obviously, Dev and I might have some disagreements there. Statist conservatives would have some disagreements with statist liberals or socialists or whatever in that regard. But that's not the argument that anyone is making. We would all agree with that, right? The question is totally unregulated, or not unregulated, totally market regulated, basically products, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I think is pretty difficult to defend. You mentioned, FDA isn't.
How is that difficult to defend? It's fairly simple.
So many examples.
Like, who are you?
There's so many examples of unregulated markets turning into complete shit when it comes to assorted, consumer safety standards and product quality standards, right? And there's examples of those same markets being, I suppose, not advantaged, but being corrected by regulation, by state government.
So first thing I would say is, when you keep saying the question is, that would be your question from a consequentialist framework. Right. So we're not even delving into the idea of, who the fuck are you to tell me what I can and can't put in my body? Right. Which you believe that you have authority via the ballot box to tell me what I can and can't put in my body, even if it would save my life. Right.
Because you're saying best and worst. And I assume we're not talking about some sort of a priori philosophical priority. Right. It seems like when you're saying best or worst, you're talking for broad society. You mentioned several examples of society being made worse by states and being made better by markets, right?
Right.
So, it seems like we're philosophically, at least for the purpose of this discussion, operating under the same framework, right? You're giving me that.
I would say first, no, I wouldn't give you that charity to only engage in your philosophical interpretation of right and wrong. I would also say that it is, first and foremost, it is descriptively wrong to tell me that you have the authority to tell me what I can and can't put in my body because you know better than me, or the government knows better than me what I can and can't do with my body, because of the unintended consequences.
Why did you go on?
Because I have a good argument on both sides. I'm right both ways. That's why.
That's all I'm saying, is that I've just responded to what your argument is, and now you've responded with, well, now let's talk about not what you just said, but let's talk about this philosophical justification that is a priori in the conversation. You should have started with that if that was really the crux of your argument, not all the...
No, I'm saying they both are. Like, we can do two things at the same time.
Well, you can, but you're not responding to anything I just said, though. That's kind of the issue.
So
like you started a new conversation, basically.
Okay, well, what would you like if you want me to respond? I'll be real quick, right? Because I just don't want to let go this assertion that I'm not responding to him, which is we have multiple examples of where the market didn't work well. And you have examples of how the other one didn't work well. And so by default, we need the immoral system of a state authority telling you what you can and can't do with your body. I think that's a real shit argument because you didn't back up the assertions of why the market would be worse. You just dismissed with the ways that the state sanctioned genocide of the gay community was comparable to how other consequences might occur under a market without backing those up, and then saying, how dare you make a moral argument later because you're shifting the conversation. Deal with my point. I think that your point really was not merited that much of an answer because you didn't engage with my point, really. You just kind of engage with a whataboutism without any examples.
No. I referenced examples of unregulated markets being poor for societal outcome, to which you then said, well, kind of, who cares about societal outcome? I just believe in the freedom of being able to do what I want with my body and buy the products that I want with my money, right?
That's not what happened, but that's okay. You didn't list any actual examples. You just said examples exist.
Maybe I'll appeal to Dev. I feel like that was a pretty reasonable summation of the argument.
What was an example you gave?
Dev is a fence setter. He's not going to take a side, to be fair.
I do actually think that's a pretty reasonable description of the second argument that you made.
He didn't give any examples. What is he talking about? He just said.
If you want me to give examples, I can.
Well,
I don't know what your response would be, but
I do have a question about the first argument though, because the first argument, like the second one, is the rights argument. You know, why shouldn't I be able to?
The first argument. We might be disagreeing on what the first argument was.
Well, just real quickly, the second argument seems to be, why shouldn't I be able to inject brake fluid into my veins if I want to? And it's like, fair enough, right? It's your body. I
it's stupid.
It's stupid, but you can do it. Yes.
Right.
But the first argument seems to be, is what you're saying something like absence of an FDA? In the absence of an FDA, there would be something like a private business that would be in the business of rating other companies' drugs and then putting out like a report that says, well, here's a good drug and here's a bad drug, something like that.
Right. So in a completely unregulated free market, there is this myth that like you have all of these market failures, right? And that the state is required to deal with these market failures, such as an information failure of, of like whether or not a drug is good to take. But what that really is a market void. Right. And without the state taking 50% of all of the wealth that we make and then, doling it back out in government programs and calling it a gift, right? Like you have so much more money, but you also have things that the government was doing that now need to be done by the market. And so the argument isn't that there would be a company that would do this. The argument is that there would be several companies that would need to do this and that they would be in competition with each other and that the consumer, both the doctors, the hospital administration staff, the dialysis clinics, the individual at the pharmacy, all of these people are attempting to gain information about what drugs should they take and what drugs should they not take, right? And they're likely going to go talk to their doctor, and their doctor may use multiple different companies, may have like a subscription to their magazine, may, look at their reports if it's, advertisement, however it is. There's several businesses that are competing for access to maintain their reputation so that when they say a drug is safe, everybody knows that that drug is safe. Right. The difference is that the system we have right now is that there's a monopoly. Only the FDA really gets to tell you that. Like there are reports and other businesses that kind of like give their opinions and things like that, but they don't have the same authority to go in, and they're tax heavily. They're not able to be made profitable, et cetera. And there's regulations involved as well as like what they can and can't do in terms of reporting whether or not a drug is safe to take, because there are laws to keep them from being able to say that if they're not FDA approved, et cetera. Right. So you have a monopoly, but worse is that this monopoly legally tells you what drugs your doctor is allowed to prescribe and for what things. And so there are people that would want experimental things. knowing that there's risk inherent, but knowing that there's like an issue that they might die soon without it, right? There are people that may have belief systems that this medication works, and maybe it doesn't, but maybe there's a placebo effect, right? Like if enough people strongly believe that ivermectin, for example, is an amazing prophylactic, despite the fact that ivermectin seems like it might be a decent prophylactic and there's no danger in taking it, but it doesn't seem to do anything once you already have COVID, right? But if enough people believe it, maybe there's a placebo effect. Maybe it's good to allow them to buy cheap medicine that, as we know, has never killed anyone ever and is way safer to take than Tylenol. I don't know, but there are unintended consequences to making things illegal. And there are unintended consequences, or we might even argue intended consequences, to this monopoly in that system. So yeah, I think an unregulated market is kind of a misnomer, because the market is regulated by the consumers, by the industry, by the individuals that purchase things.
Okay, I think I know what you're saying. I'm not entirely sure, just because you could have a situation where, in the absence of an FDA, you have companies whose job it is to investigate drugs to see if they're good drugs or bad drugs.
Mm-hmm.
But there may because regular people don't have the knowledge to know if a drug is good or not. They don't.
You just go to your doctor, right? And you trust your doctor, or you don't trust your doctor.
But it just feels like it may be the case that because these companies are incentivized to find bad drugs and publish about them, that they may end up publishing false things because they're financially incentivized to do so. Right,
but they're not a monopoly, right? So the more that they engage in fraud, they can be sued for that, obviously. But let's assume they skirt the fence and they're able to not get sued for fraud, and they're able to like trash things, and maybe they create a conglomerate or like a cartel with other drug companies and kind of, you know what I mean? And like only publish the most favorable results. Well, their entire market is accurate information. And so they can give inaccurate information just like the FDA does, just like, and it happens all the time. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes it's intentional. But the more accurate information you put out, the more people that are harmed by this, especially if it's fraud, they're going to go out of business real quick. But that's the whole point of a competition, is that some company that does it better will be more respected by doctors and associations than a company that has less respect. And currently we don't have that. We just have the government. And I think most people kind of intuitively know the government's not the best at almost anything.
Well, I think we do have that though. Like we have brand equity in pretty much every market, right? I mean, when we talk about, people preferring certain products and services because of basically the name it comes from. Like for instance, I would imagine, I could be wrong, but I would imagine in the future, right? If Pfizer and Moderna and Johnson & Johnson, if they were to come out with more vaccines in the future, I think a lot of people would naturally say, oh yeah, I'm more trusting of that vaccine because they've come
lefties
up with
would.
The COVID vaccines, right?
Lefties would. Righties would be the opposite, obviously.
Well, I think that most right-wingers, despite what we would believe online, are actually vaccinated. I think like almost 95% of the population above 65 is vaccinated, which of course is a hell of a lot of right-wingers. So I don't.
Yeah, that's what happens when you make it illegal for the people to work.
Well, I don't think America has made it illegal to work if you're not vaccinated.
The best part about being a YouTuber is I could be completely lazy about the vaccine. I'm not even against it. I just didn't want to go outside. I was like, fuck it.
Yeah, if you just stay inside all day, I guess you don't need to get vaccinated. But anyway, I don't know. It's hard to buy those types of arguments because here's a question, right? So when we think of like sort of historical examples of like less regulated markets maybe not leading to the best outcomes. Like we can think of lead in gasoline or something as maybe a classic example, or like, examples of regulations working to some extent, right? So like, requiring people to wear seatbelts or something, or having
also,
like airbags.
I just want to point out, I just want to point out it's 78% have at least one dose, and 66% are fully vaccinated, but fair enough.
78% of what? I mentioned above 65s. At least that's the data that I.
Above 65. Okay, yeah. That's probably
old people,
fair.
Basically, yeah.
Wait,
but anyway,
is 78 the American total? I thought you guys would be higher than that.
Fortunately, we have a little bit more freedom than other places.
See, I think we're at like 85 here, I think, around there. Okay, sorry, go on, Econoboi, sorry.
Well, anyway, the question I was going to ask Fabian is like the examples that we would think of either regulations working in terms of societal outcomes or examples of unregulated or less regulated markets maybe not working in terms of societal outcomes being solved by regulations. What is the response to those examples? I gave a couple examples, or I guess 3 examples.
I haven't heard it. I haven't heard a single example yet of like a specific. Leaded gasoline.
I talked about leaded gasoline. I talked about seatbelts. I talked about airbags. I mean, those are just basically product safety standards, right? That seem to have had positive outcomes.
So your argument is that the market couldn't handle leaded gasoline, but government did? Is that the argument?
Well, my argument is that the market didn't handle it at all. The
right.
market poisoned millions of people with lead,
right.
And the government came in and stopped that, right? And so my question really is, from your perspective, would you say that would eventually get solved by the market, or would you say that the government would really solve it? Or
I would say that the leaded gasoline situation almost certainly would have been solved much quicker if not for the government. And that what you just gave me is an example of how the government slowed that process. I mean, I think the government was required to step in on this because you're saying, well, the market didn't regulate these things, but the government has the de facto power on and authority on like environmental protection and in protecting people. There's no market void because the government is already there, right? So the government is the de facto thing that people are looking towards to solve this. And the government had all of these congressional hearings and, and of course bought off politicians, lied for years and years and years, and, took certain corporations that were promulgating false data and trying to discredit the scientists that discovered the issue with leaded gasoline. I mean, he had to fight as an individual over and over and over again, solved carbon dating while doing it, and created like the first clean labs so that he could get rid of leaded gas, so he could get rid of all the lead in the environment in order to solve carbon dating. So, I mean, he came up with all kinds of innovations, right? But I feel like if we had a competition of companies, we would have had a competition of information out there, and people would have been inclined far more to believe it as opposed to a government purchased by corporations that allowed this problem to continue for so long. And so I think the crime and the violence and the death of the government and their failures to fix this problem is a good example, probably more so for me than for you.
Well, but it sounds like you've created a world where you'd literally never, ever give the government any credit when it comes to regulating anything. I mean, the market was free, as far as I'm aware, right? I mean, the market was free at any time. Well, hold on. The market was free at any time during the leaded gasoline issues, and I think it was basically the 40s to the 60s. The market was free for 20, 30 years to solve that problem, and they didn't. And your response to that seems to be, well, they didn't solve that problem because they were relying on the government to solve that problem. And if we didn't have the government as a means to regulate that problem, then I guess markets would be more self-reliant and they would solve those problems.
I think it's, first of all, that's just totally false that the market was free. The idea that the market was
unregulated. I mean, we weren't obviously regulating it because it was happening, right?
Whether or not you're specifically regulating gasoline does not somehow make it a free market that has the means and the ability to regulate in the way that it would if it wasn't taxed to death.
You're repeating yourself. Right? I mean,
because I'm right again, right? Like, and you're wrong in saying it's a free market or that it's unregulated. It's a heavily regulated market. Just because they weren't regulating leaded gasoline, nobody in the 40s and 60s knew that this was a problem, right? This isn't a failure of the government or a failure of the market to regulate lead out of gasoline. They were not aware of how much gasoline was going into the environment. They weren't aware of how.
You're wrong though. This is an example where the people who invented just 1 second, the people who invented that form of gasoline, that form of combustion, they did know that it was toxic. They did not release that information, right? And so what I'm saying is that what we had in this scenario is a circumstance where a private company is incentivized not to tell the truth because obviously it's profitable. We've got a scenario where the market is unwilling or unable to regulate it themselves. Apparently, your
Unwilling.
explanation for their unwillingness and unableness, let's say, to
Right.
regulate it is because they basically were relying on the government. And so all that I'm pointing out is that you've created a framework by which it would never be the case that a market failure exists inherently. It just couldn't exist in your system, right? And that's fine. But then now we're also creating a circumstance where regulations could literally never work, because any example of a regulation working would be it working slower and worse than the market. And any example of a regulation failing is another example that you could use to say that government's bad. And I don't think that that's the most holistic way to analyze a situation. It doesn't.
I think it's perfectly accurate to say that the government was slow to respond because they had a monopoly on being able to tell people like what should and shouldn't be regulated, and that they are put on a pedestal. Both, I mean, this is society's fault too, right? For thinking that like the EPA is effective in any way, or that Congress actually gives a fuck about them. You say that it's disingenuous for me to
here, 40s,
guys,
well,
no.
Let me hop in here finally, okay? So it seems like there's a disagreement on fact at this point. So is it or is it not the case that the people who were producing leaded gasoline knew that it was toxic before everyone else did?
They knew they knew in the 50s, like 20 years before anybody else knew, that there was a lot of issues like at the manufacturing level. Right. So they knew that like a lot of workers were getting lead poisoning and getting really sick. And that eventually came out after they basically bought their own scientists. Right. And when they went to Congress, they just like lied about it and committed fraud to Congress and just said like, oh, this isn't an issue. This is pseudo-scientific garbage. Like, and they did everything they could to discredit. I can't remember the scientist's name off the top of my head, but they did everything they could to discredit him, ruin his reputation, etc. And he just like fought relentlessly for like a long fucking time to eventually prove this correct. But yes, the companies themselves that were making leaded gasoline lied about, like kept data that they had that knew that this was dangerous. I don't know. I could be wrong. Maybe Econoboi can correct me here. I don't know if they knew that this was like, that the unleaded gasoline from the cars was like poisoning everyone, etc. I'm not sure if that, or when they knew that, or etc.
Well, I think we've known that lead is toxic to people for like hundreds of years, even at the point of the 1940s. And the issue was that when he created this type of fuel and combustion, the scientists that created it basically renamed it something to try and obfuscate the fact that it had fucking lead in it, right?
Right.
And basically the argument was that, well, because this is a distinct compound, the lead component in this, leaded gasoline or whatever it is, isn't toxic, right? That was the argument that sort of
right. It's the same. It's the same thing with like the Teflon, right? Where like the
I don't know about Teflon.
Well,
what
Teflon has poisoned millions of Americans, basically everyone in America and in the first world, for the most part, has some form of Teflon cancer-causing agents in them, and has been poisoned to some degree by the mass production of Teflon. And it's just like carbon molecules stacked on top of each other, on top of each other, on top of each other, and they never break down. And the EPA had like no idea. They didn't have any understanding on how to regulate this or anything like that. And it wasn't until like lawyers stepped in from like small communities where they were dumping the waste in the water, and they were like allowed to by the government because the government didn't consider it like a toxic thing or whatever. And like people were like extreme cancer rates in small town that they had to fight the government. They had to fight them, both the corporation and the state a little bit. For years, they eventually won. And then it turned into like they won, but there was all these kinds of loopholes, and it's like still an issue today that the companies that have mass produced Teflon since World War II really haven't paid anything for it or anything like that.
Yeah, so the 1940s example is interesting. I don't think the reason I would call it unregulated is because I don't think I don't think the market had a robust understanding that like it was the responsibility of the government to regulate sort of environmental hazards or concerns at that point. Obviously, we didn't have an EPA, although we didn't also have literally zero environmental regulations. So that's one thing. But I mean, we can go farther and farther back in time, and I think eventually, certainly, we would you'd have to concede, I would imagine, at some point that we did have sort of unregulated markets, and there were certainly points in history across the world where governments existed, but the economic involvement of the government was fairly minuscule, let's say.
The only unregulated market that I can think of in like a society that isn't that you could call like anything resembling capitalism would be the Republic of Kospaya. Would probably be from 1440 to 1826, in between the papal states of Italy and Florence. I think that would be really the only example I can think of off the top of my head of a historical unregulated capitalist market. And even then, there's like a council of elders kind of situation. So there's like some.
Well, but are you just saying like just the presence of a government, despite that government's regulatory reach, is basically
the presence of a state? Like a government that's voluntary is well, I mean, I would say that even capitalism is regulated. It's just, how is it regulated, right? Is it regulated by consumers in the market, or is it regulated by central planners? And a monopoly on regulation, and a government that is purchasable by individuals with enough capital and power.
I get that. My point is more so saying that we can look at examples of markets that were unregulated by the state, and therefore markets that I'm not sure at the time had any sort of, dependence on the idea that the government would regulate them at the time. And it seems like in those circumstances, we do see basically poor outcomes related to, market activities, let's say, economic activities, right?
Yeah, I just wouldn't agree with that approximation of history, that historical analysis that we see issues with market failures when what we have is regulated and taxed and IP patent law economies that are already mixed economies, that aren't free market economies. And then we talk about the successes of the state as if they're like, they did do these things that the market didn't do. And then we don't talk about extreme taxation that also limits the market. So you have all of these pressures on the market's ability to be efficient. And then we have all of this theft from people and from the market. And then the government does something that course corrected or fixed something that was a problem before. And then we go, see, the market didn't do this, the government did. And it's like, well, when did you give the market a fucking fighting chance?
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I guess I just, when we talk about the views of history and how they relate to, I suppose, the development of our ideologies, I'm not sure it's the most holistic view to say that essentially when the government regulates something and it seems like it works, that's ultimately always worse than if the free market did it itself. It seems like you can do a pretty simple, just like a simple regression discontinuity on different regulations that happens and like the sort of effects that we would care about in terms of the regulation. And it seems like it sounds like you might actually agree that regulations can work. It seems like your argument is just that the free market unimpeded by government would do a better job regulating than the government itself. So maybe that's not the response to your argument.
What I would say really is like a Hayekian kind of like analysis of it, which is that yes, a regulation can make the situation better, but a state of central planners is, in order to determine price or in order to determine the issue that needs to be fixed in some regard, has to steal wealth at an ever increasing rate to get more and more accurate information, and that it can't compete with the information that's available in a market. And thus it is definitionally always going to be less efficient than the market's capacity to regulate in that regard. And so I would just simply say it is impossible for the state to do a better job than the market because of that very issue of the central planners needing to determine price or needing to determine the causes and effects, and et cetera, and that costs wealth that must be stolen from the economy, and that efficiency just can't possibly ever be as good as a market. So I would always make that argument from that perspective.
This is the road to serfdom argument.
Yeah, I mean, he makes it. Hayek makes the argument several times, and that's kind of like the derivation of the economic calculation problem, right? Like the state can't determine price; it just can't. And so, and it costs more and more money for them to get more of an accurate analysis of trying to determine, like where the price equation might fall, et cetera. And so, yeah, like the market is always going to be better, just definitionally, than a government that's wasting stolen resources.
Well, more efficient, yes, but I don't know about better though, because sometimes it's reasonable to sacrifice efficiency to maintain like broader coverage, for example.
Can you give me an example?
Well, I do think that the medical conversation that we had earlier is probably a decent example of that, where rather than relying on multiple private companies that have the job of investigating these drugs to see if they're actually doing what they say that they do, or if they have bad side effects, or whatever the case may be. Sometimes you might have a less efficient system like the FDA that does have its set of problems, but because it's a universalized system, everyone gets access to it. And that might be worth the trade-off of it being less efficient.
This is why I engage in Fabian, the libertarian strategy,
Can
right?
we define what efficiency means? I'm not sure what you guys mean when you're. We might also be working on different definitions.
Well, I mean, efficiency of like desired outcome versus, input of capital. Is that fine?
So efficiency is when people get what they want, basically.
No.
No, I mean like price to performance ratio, right? Like how much capital is invested, and like how well is the solution presented by the state able to do whatever its a goal was.
Right. So
when people get what they want for the lowest possible input.
Well, I would say price to performance ratio, right? Like, what I mean?
Well, sure, yeah.
You had mentioned something that made me think of The Road to Serfdom, and I think what Hayek wrote in that was something along the lines of, the state has to extract money from the economy to perform these services, and that which makes the economy less efficient, and in order to get the best possible service from the state, it has to extract the maximum amount of money, and so there ends up being, I think, like a bell curve, where sometimes the state might extract way too much, and the service is not at all worth what you're paying for it, and sometimes they extract too less and it becomes too unregulated.
Well, I mean, I would argue that
there's a medium there.
Yeah, I would argue that like the market would still do better in all regards. Even if you had like a standard distribution, you hit the sweet spot, right? In terms of state efficiency, there's still a monopoly of central planners that are not going to be able to engage with solving the problem at the same degree. In terms of like the FDA though, and why I was saying like Fabian libertarianism is like, why can't I opt out? Like that, like, and this is kind of the thing, is that like the argument is, well, the FDA is better, and okay, that's your opinion. I disagree. Why do I not have the right to smoke weed while I'm on cancer? Why do I not have the right to take certain holistic medications that may or may not work? Why do I not have the right to purchase baby formula that has far less soy and estrogen and far less, issues from Europe, right, than the American ones? Why do I not have the right to opt out of the regulations of the FDA? Cool, it's not FDA approved. Why can't I take that risk myself? Why do other people get to tell me, no, the FDA says it, so just do it? If it's so great, if it's better than what the market can handle, like, why don't I have that freedom to challenge that assertion and have other institutions and things working alongside the FDA? Why can't I have both? Even if that taxation and that authority granted is more efficient because of the very regulation that they impose on the market that makes it more efficient. Even if that's the case, why not both?
Okay, so I think this is the second argument now, right? The first argument was the economic one. This
is the second is this is the moral argument. Like, why do you have the right to go to the ballot box and tell me what I can and can't do with my body, and prove that there are more efficient means and there are better medications and there are issues with the FDA?
See, I think on this conversation, this is where I pretty much just agree with you. Like, I've always been a proponent of right to try. I've always been like, if you want, it's like I said, if you want to inject the brake fluid, even though it's stupid, like, why shouldn't you? It's you're not hurting anybody else. It's just you. That's always been my view of it.
I mean, would you agree, Econoboi?
Break fluid into yourself if you want. I don't think anybody's stopping you from doing that, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I guess the idea is like, here's a great example. How come, as a Canadian, I can't bring Kinder Surprise eggs into the United States?
I don't know what a Kinder Surprise is.
It's a Swedish candy, and like a couple of kids choked, so now it's just illegal.
Yeah. So here's how it works. Okay. It's in Canada. It's in Europe. It's a chocolate egg, and inside the chocolate egg, there's a toy that you can assemble. So it comes with little instructions and little pieces, and kids love them. But because in the United States, like 50 years ago or whatever, some kids ate the toy and then choked because it was small pieces, the Americans have banned them. And that just seems ridiculous to me. Like, why can't
Americans banned it or Canadians did?
The Americans banned it. Okay?
Oh, okay.
We still have them in Canada. We are the true free country, Econoboi.
Well,
no, have Kinder Surprise eggs.
I think Kinder
Canada's an authoritarian country, you know.
Kinder is like not even like. There's so much better examples. My question is, why can't I purchase insulin from Canada? It's illegal.
Well, I mean, look,
it's against the law for me to get cheaper insulin that's perfectly safe for a diabetic.
Well, more price regulated insulin, right? So, I think if the argument is we should be able to purchase medicine from countries with more socialized medicine, I'm not sure I have a lot of disagreement there. I think that I get the point, right?
I mean, America also produces 57% of all new chemical compounds and pharmaceuticals, right? Like, a lot of those socialized medicine places are, kind of depending upon the less regulated American market in order to get any of those fucking drugs to begin with.
Well, I guess the question just seems to be, even though some regulatory body has said that this is unsafe, and you're fully aware that it's unsafe, why can't you do it anyway? If you're like, listen, I'll take the responsibility to do this unsafe thing. Just leave me alone. If I die, I die. But just let me do it. That seems to be the argument.
Right.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I to be fair, I'm not sure what the process is that I'm about to describe. But I believe there are methods by which you can get like off-label drugs. You can be part of clinical trials. There is right to try in America. That is a law now. I mean, so I just don't know.
Oh, is there?
I don't know to what extent we actually have like
Trump instituted right to try for things that are currently going through FDA regulation or going through clinical trials, et cetera, right? Now, if the FDA simply rejects something, there is no right to try in America, right? So like when the FDA rejected everything basically but AZT, which was poison to the gay community, right? They forcibly regulated and stopped the distribution of drugs from Mexico and vitamins and things like that, that were doctor prescribed, that would have saved so many people's lives from the AIDS epidemic, because the government knew better and you didn't have a right to do it, and they committed a genocide against people.
I don't know what the consequence is in that regard. Like, if I could be wrong here, but like if you have, say that you import a medicine from like Italy or something, and you think it'll help you, but the American government doesn't approve of it. What is like do you go to prison for trying it? I really don't know, because when we use the example of like if you want to inject brake fluid into yourself, you should be able to. It's like, well, you can do that though. So if
you can illegally get past customs, then yes, you can get it, but you have to break the law for smuggling drugs into the country. And if they catch you, you will be fined and eventually go to prison, as as has happened to other people that have attempted to smuggle in drugs, right? They stop you from doing it. Absent of going to those countries and sneaking them in your suitcase and hoping that you get past the TSA, no, you cannot get those things. The state forces you to not be able to do so. And most people, most people aren't willing to like try and illegally smuggle drugs because the United States government won't let them have it. They'll usually die and trust their doctors. That's what they'll do. They'll usually just die. Now, are those drugs actually going to save their life? I don't fucking know. It depends on the drug, right? But my question really still remains and hasn't been answered. Like, why? Why can we not be allowed to fucking try experimental drugs? Your answer is, well, there's right to try for things that are currently going through clinical trials at the FDA. That's not fucking good enough.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's almost a comment on like the sort of rule utilitarian nature of how we govern ourselves, right? So, and I don't know. I mean, to me, again, there could be some gaps in that regard, right? I mean, the obvious answer to me is that you don't want to create an environment where people are allowed to sell and distribute unregulated and untested and unapproved drugs to people, because that atmosphere and that environment is like net worse for society than an atmosphere where you can do those things, I suppose, right? I mean, it just goes back to the argument of why we have an FDA in the first place.
Yeah, it's like it's a rights-based argument versus consequentialism, right? You're a consequentialist, so
sure, yeah.
you don't care if some individual rights are violated if it presumably, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, so you don't know, but given the best evidence available, more people less people are harmed. Therefore, you don't give a fuck that someone's rights are violated or that some people die. The ends justify the means. Some people can die for the good of others not dying in some regard, because, if 10 people die in one system and 100 die the other way, you don't give a fuck if you can save presumably 90 lives.
Well, sure. I mean, I'm not, and I don't know, maybe that would be a question for the audience. I guess everyone has to answer that question themselves, right?
Right.
It's like, I feel like at the end of the day, if we really boiled it down, I think that most people operate under some sort of consequentialist framework, because again, when we talk about like morally impugning someone for saying, yeah, like this is a good example. When the 2020 presidential election was going on, Vosh was getting a bunch of bumped my mic there. Vosh was getting a bunch of shit for saying that he was going to vote for Biden, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a bunch of socialists, like anti or like Bernie or bust people, were calling on in the stream and saying like, well, but like, what the fuck? So like, you're saying if someone was going to be elected who was going to kill 100 million people with nukes versus someone who said they're only going to kill 10 million, you'd support the person who's going to kill 10 million people?
Yeah.
Which Voss said, well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't see the problem with saying that I'm going to save 90 million lives, right?
Yeah, of course.
Is 90 million people being saved not a good?
Yeah, I mean, it's just an expansion, a more realistic view of the trolley car problem. Will you pull the lever to murder one person? If it stops the train from rolling on over 5 people, most people, unfortunately, would pull the lever and intentionally murder someone. Most people are murderers in their philosophy.
Right. And it's a matter of like how we view the role of stigma and like regulatory powers, right? So
but the problem is the trolley car problem is a fantasy, because it gives you this perfect explanation where you actually know the outcomes of your decisions, whereas in the real world you don't actually know the outcomes of your decisions. You don't know what the long-term consequences are. And so engaging in a consequentialist analysis always means your best guess as to whether or not something is right or wrong.
Well, yeah, that gets into a deeper question of like, if we can glean moral truth and all that kind of stuff, which I'm not sure how relevant it is in this discussion, but it's just to say that I was going to give the example of like doing like cocaine and heroin, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, I think most people would agree that if you regularly do things like meth and heroin and cocaine, that's not good for you. Same thing with drinking alcohol, to be fair, right?
Right, of course.
But the question is like, how much does social stigma affect people's health outcomes when it comes to an environment where those things are legal? And how much does just banning them outright affect those people's desire to do those things and the outcomes thereof, right? And so what it seems like is that in the world that we live in, you can run different experiments. Different governments have all sorts of different regulations and like, different states that they live in, right? And we can kind of come to some, utilitarian truth, which is that it doesn't seem like harshly criminalizing drugs leads to less people doing them, and it doesn't seem like it leads to better societal outcomes, right? If you care about health outcomes and like addiction rates and stuff like that, right? And so the question of like, well, how holistic does right to try have to be, right? And what are the outcomes associated with a more expansive right to try law? I don't really know the answer to that question. I'm not sure what the different states are that people live in terms of being able to just try drugs because you want to try them. I really don't know the answer to that question. But my answer would be, like Fabian said, ultimately consequentialist, which is that, if a state ran an experiment and basically said like, hey, yeah, it turns out right to try doesn't really lead to poor negative outcomes. It doesn't lead to like shoddy markets of people giving bullshit drugs to people who are desperate. I mean, sure, that would be fine then. It's just that, doing a historical analysis and trying to understand what happens when we allow basically people to sell to people who are extremely desperate, it doesn't seem to work out.
Yeah. And that's really the crux. That's the serious problem with doing consequentialist analysis like that, is that what you don't know is the consequences. You don't know. You have a guess based off of immediate consequences. What is the consequence 200 years from now from a society that deeply regulates drug? And what is a society that has a open drug culture? And like, what are all of the factors? You don't know. You don't know what the consequences are. What I would say,
right?
Well, yeah, you still won't know. You'll never know. It's impossible to know unless you're God and you're.
We've talked about that before, but yeah, I think experiments do.
Well, no, it's just they increase your probability of having a good idea, right? And so it's really just good guesswork. But what I would say, right, is that there is an objective situation that we can put this analysis through, and that's natural law philosophy. And if you look at it from a natural law perspective, it's very simple and objective. There's no need to engage in like what are the consequences one way or the other. You can simply say that you have initiated conflict by coercing other people into what they can and can't do with their life, and that the state is a criminal in this regard. And then it's the individual's responsibility to decide what goes in their body. It's the community and the family's responsibility as to how they choose to engage with these people, whether they choose to disassociate or attempt to help these people, etc. And that the state is definitionally causing conflict, and then by aggressing upon these people. And so I have an answer in terms of like the avoidance of conflict. And the answer is objectively true, that the state is criminal in its behavior in forcing people to not be able to engage in the free transactions that they wish to engage in, and not being able to do with their bodies what the fuck they want to do.
So I want to point out that I have maybe 20 minutes left.
Yeah, fair enough. I hope this was a good conversation thus far. I'm just kind of going with the flow.
No, this is
I don't have an agenda here other than just like answering questions and hoping that people can like be exposed to the ideology.
I hope you two are having fun at least.
Yeah.
I guess in terms of the morality question, I've always felt that all of us are probably a little bit consequentialist, but also a little bit deontological, Like
and a little bit virtue ethicist, right? That's why they're the three branches of normative ethics.
Yeah, we all seem to follow all of them at once, depending on what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Because if the most anti-consequentialist person, if he's told to either rape this baby or the world will explode, you're probably going to do it because the stakes are too high.
I will never rape the baby. I reject it. I'll let the world explode.
You'll let the world explode? Okay. Well, most people...
Actually, I won't even do it as an deontologist. I'll do it as a virtue ethicist. I'll do everything I can to beat this man to death.
But let's say, it's built into the universe. This is just how it's going to go. The idea is if the stakes are high enough, then people will generally default to looking at the consequences of their actions. But at the same time, the way that we judge whether or not a thing is good or bad before we even reach the consequences part of the conversation seems to be entirely just based on our own feelings.
Yeah. Well, the thing about anarcho-capitalism, right, is that it's not a moral prescription, right? Natural law is not a moral prescription. It is simply an objective truth of what is and isn't illegal in terms of the non-aggression principle and in terms of the normative framework of self-ownership that both of you cannot argue against, because if you argue against it, you're engaging in a performative contradiction because you attempt to change my mind, thus recognizing my own autonomy and consciousness. So, but it's not necessarily a moral prescription. It's just saying if your goal is conflict avoidance and non-aggression, as a means of reduction of conflict and maximizing, that behavior, then this is what you must follow. And these are kind of the rules that stem from it moving forward. So it's not really a moral philosophy. Huh?
But why should that be your goal? Reducing conflict.
Would you like to argue against it? Because then we can explain argumentation ethics, right? And we can explain why you're engaging in it. I mean, whether or not you should, I mean, you could take any form of moral system, right? Like you could take a virtue ethicist position to say that it is good because, the virtue of peace and the virtue of, wisdom and the virtue, et cetera, is a good thing. You could take a consequentialist like David Friedman does. He's a consequentialist ANCAP, and simply say that, this system is the one that leads to the most good outcomes because of the nature of that conflict, of reduction of conflict to the maximum potential. Or you could take a deontological Christian position, right? And say that God says you can't murder and God says you can't steal. And of course, God says you can't, it's in the 10 Commandments. So therefore a state can't exist that forces taxation on people because that is theft. And that's a violation of the 10 Commandments, right? So there's multiple reasons as to why one might not do that from their moral prescriptions.
I could also imagine, for example, a deontological code that would value conflict. And so they'd be like, we should maximize it. It seems to boil down.
Well, they couldn't argue that though.
Why not?
Well, if you argue that we should maximize conflict, right, and that we should use violence and that we should coerce people through those violent means, what you're doing is you're engaging in argumentation with me about that. And so you already accept the norm of nonviolence as a means of resolution, and you already accept you're already against coercion as a means to discovering my truth and understanding what it is I am. And you're trying to convince me based off of argumentation. You'd have right. The only way you could argue that would be to not argue it and to simply go around murdering everybody the moment they disagreed with anything you believed in.
Right. So I guess the point that I'm getting at just seems to be that consequentialism is downstream from our feelings, I think. I talked to a socialist about this like a week or two ago, where he was very much a utilitarian. And I was just like, well, listen, why do you value the things that you value? Why is it that you have defined A as good and B as bad, and then so consequence A is the good consequence? It's because you feel that it's good, right? It's all just how you feel in the end.
Right.
There doesn't seem to be anything beyond that.
Well, that's the biggest problem with consequentialism is that you use your intuition, right, to determine what you think is wrong, and that already biases your analysis of the consequences, right? Like if I approach something from a consequentialist manner, right, I am always going to believe that the state is stealing and ineffective, right? And so that's going to bias the way that I attempt to understand the consequences, the information that I choose, how the hierarchy of information as to whether or not I feel like it's more important. Because what we're doing is we're guessing what the future will be, and our subjective bias in our analysis plays a role in consequentialist analysis, and it further waters down whether or not consequentialism, or even I would go so far as to say rule consequentialism and the rules that we create, it waters down our capacity for being able to determine what is right and wrong.
Right. But how is your moral framework not also based fundamentally on feeling, though?
I think they all are.
Well, my moral framework, or my framework as an anarcho-capitalist, because as
like when we say
because as an anarcho-capitalist, it's objective. It's objectively true. I've derived it from logic and from axioms, so it's not biased because it is whether or not it is or isn't true.
That's kind of my so any moral framework under that sort of logic can be objectively true, right? I could establish like a utilitarian framework and say you can spit out, you can model morality based on a utilitarian framework and spit out things that are true or false. In that sense, it's objective, right? The real question is like, well,
no.
How do you justify the fact that you're stating not only is it objective, but it's a moral truth of the universe that what I'm saying is correct, right? How is it not just feelings? That's my question. Right.
Anarcho-capitalism, you're attempting to bridge the ought-is issue here, and you're attempting to make natural law a moral philosophy. Now, some ANCAPs believe that argumentation ethics successfully does this. But anarcho-capitalism philosophy is not a moral system. It is an objective legal framework based upon the idea of conflict, of avoidance of conflict. So if you believe that one should avoid conflict,
justify that though?
Right. So what you're asking is, how do you justify the avoidance of conflict?
Sure.
As a norm? I would say that that by arguing and engaging in argumentation, you already justify this. And if you argue against it, you're engaging in a performative contradiction. It is illogical of you to attempt to convince me that we shouldn't accept the non-aggression principle. You already accept the non-aggression principle. It's just that
I'm not saying I don't. I'm more so asking, how do you justify to someone who does not accept that? How do you rationalize them into saying you ought to follow the non-aggression principle when they don't? Right. I guess what
jump in here because I have about 10 minutes. I do have some super chats that are addressed to you guys. So
argumentation ethics is a difficult thing, but look up. If you're interested in it, Hoppe's 2017 revision of argumentation ethics, it will give you a great explanation.
I think just a TLDR based on my intuition of what I'm hearing, it sounds like the fact that you argue means that you value arguing over fighting because you're trying to resolve the argument not by fighting but by talking about it. And I think like at some point last year, Destiny debated an Islamist, and his point of view was basically that liberalism was oppressing Muslims because it was preventing Muslims from oppressing gay people, for example. And that was his argument. And Destiny couldn't quite wrap his head around it, but I understood it because there's like that's the it was that one, it was the Nazi guy, Carl Schmitt. He had an idea.
Nazi guy.
Yeah. Well, he was a judge in Nazi Germany back in the day. But he wrote something on this where basically the basic idea is that liberalism pre-assumes a neutral position, and so if you're going outside of that, then you're automatically in the wrong. But for example, a Muslim might say, when I aggressively attack a gay person, I'm actually acting in self-defense because I have a different framework of what neutrality is. And
I think
kind of his argument.
Yeah, I mean, Destiny has difficulty with a lot of things. That's why I've crushed him every time I've debated him. But I have to throw that out there. But yeah, first of all, apparently people in the DGG community occasionally call me Destiny's best friend, cheekily. But because he just gets frustrated eventually and quits and just goes and eats food and like can't deal with me. Usually just shuts up at a certain point. But no, I would say that first of all, you're acting it out. You're physically and acting out your value of that. And the second thing, to respond to Destiny's difficulty dealing with that, it's really simple. It's, you don't have a right to aggress upon others. You don't have a right to aggress upon others and call that a form of self-defense because your philosophy allows you to aggress upon others. It's contradictory. Like, it's not self-defense because they're not aggressing upon you. The only thing they're not letting you do is not harm other people. And so like, that's just a stupid contradiction. And I could just laugh at that.
I agree with you. I definitely agree with you here. Like, personally, I absolutely agree with you. But the framework that he was operating under is that he had a different definition of what the neutral space is, of what constitutes aggression and self-defense, that allowed him to do that.
Yeah, and he's just wrong.
So he was just saying, I'm outside of this framework that you have. I exist somewhere else.
Yeah, murder is not aggression because it's Jews. Like, that doesn't make sense.
No, I don't agree. I don't agree either. But it's an idea that I don't think Destiny fully reply. I mean, Destiny was ultimately correct. He was just like incredulous. He's like, how could you possibly think this? I was like, well, here's how he thinks it, It's that kind of thing. Let me see.
But super chats, yes. Give your audience what they're asking. It's fair. I'm sure a bunch of them are fired up to yell at me.
Actually, my audience is generally more right-leaning than me.
I'm not really that much of a right-winger, to be fair.
The first one is from I am wrong for €2. This is I think the most this is the most basic ANCAP question. How can you a functioning society without government?
I don't know how to answer that other than look at the Republic of Kospaya from 1440 to 1826. What is it? And second of all, we're not against government. We're against a state. A state is a government that is illegitimate because of its theft of property and its violence towards its people by the theft of its property, especially when you look at, let's say, colonialism and all that other shit, right? And so it's illegitimate by that. It's illegitimate by the property that it owns. Because it didn't voluntarily purchase that property. And it's illegitimate by the fact that it enables a social contract theory where there's this weird implicit contract that, like, because you were born here, you agree to all of the rules and the oppression that goes along with it. But a voluntary society that doesn't steal from its citizens and has a system of governance that everyone voluntarily chooses to is perfectly acceptable. It's called a covenant community, and that's perfectly in line with anarcho-capitalism. So a society, so if you feel that you need a structured government with checks and balances, my answer is you can have that in anarcho-capitalism.
Okay, so here's Saito T. Doge. He says, Fabian, I'm with you. I came to anarcho-capitalism as the logical extension of liberalism, classical liberal to libertarian to ANCAP.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the Enlightenment, the modernist values, as opposed to like the pre-modern religious right and the postmodern left, that, you know, once they realize all truth is subjective, they just piggyback Marxist philosophy. You know, that these two people are philosophically the instantiations of the right wing and the left wing, and liberalism, modernism, was the philosophy that if you follow its thoughts through to conclusion, you eventually come to objectivism, minarchism, anarcho-capitalism, voluntarism.
Right. I actually have a friend, maybe you know her, Aiden Paladin. You've heard that name?
No, sorry.
My size. She's what she calls a libertarian monarchist. That's a very interesting philosophy. It sounds kind of strange, but you might talk to her. She's actually
my co-host apparently knows. My co-host knows who he is. Maybe can you DM me and like maybe we could talk to her. It'd be fun.
Sure. Because she's very well educated and she's very smart, but she's also really fucking crazy. I like her a lot.
Well, I don't know her, so I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question. This is actually just a statement. Leaded gas. This is to Econoboi. Leaded gas was banned, actually, because it wrecked catalytic converters, which were being mandated at the time in 1975. It was never about health. Is that true? I don't know.
I don't think that that's true. I think that there was quite an outcry once several studies had been published about it, and that caused the democratically accountable government to ban it. I don't know if it was just yes, it's bad for your engine. It's probably a little bit more complicated than that. I'm sure you could probably find some article saying that was why, but
there are. I mean, I've not heard this, but I mean, I may be interested in researching it more. I'm going to save this article. There's an article I found, how leaded gas came to be and why we don't miss it, and they talk about catalytic converters being destroyed by leaded gas. I don't know. Yeah, I'll have to research that. Thank you.
So this is also a question for Econoboi.
Okay.
I think this is in reference to you saying something about the FDA. If the FDA were better, if it had like less abuses or less failures, that
what
kind
have
of
I
thing.
done?
So he says, is slavery moral if you never hurt your slaves? The state having authority and using it well doesn't make it moral.
Yeah, I've heard different philosophers contend with this question before. I feel like I fall on the side of.
Yo, it's a good question.
It's kind of like what Fabian was saying. Is like it's almost a necessary contradiction. Like, can you have voluntary slavery? That's kind of where I end up on it. Like, it doesn't. It's almost an oxymoron, the idea of voluntary slavery. So it's hard for me to answer because, from my point of view, it seems literally impossible to volunteer yourself to be a slave.
No matter how much Dr. Walter Block says you can, I'm not convinced. Dr. Walter Block makes that argument about voluntary slavery, and I'm like, no, go fuck yourself. So,
yeah,
it's like the biggest thing. I'm like, Dr. Walter Block, I think you're just wrong.
Right. I'm not a philosopher, so I mean, I'm totally willing to be proven wrong on like utilitarianism, the question we just asked. Like, there's a lot of philosophical arguments that like I can hear people out on, but Yeah, the idea of voluntary slavery just seems like a necessary impossibility. So I would answer that I can't answer the question because it doesn't make any logical sense.
Econoboi, is your sex life that vanilla?
Is it? Did I reference my sex life during this?
Okay, never mind.
I don't know. I think my wife and I do okay, I guess.
Actually, Econoboi, at some point I want to pick your brain about another book that I'm reading, and I'm reading a book about Nazi Germany's domestic economic policy during the 12 years the Nazis were in power, and I want
Nazi economics, fascist economics. Those are all very. I mean, I think we talked about that in our first discussion. That it's a very interesting.
Yes, but now I'm reading
very
a book
interesting, very interesting segment of economics. The idea of how do you even define, like the Nazi economy, right? Was it capitalist? Was it socialist? I mean, it's probably neither. So.
Yeah, there's just some like ideas I don't fully understand, so I might bug you about it. But it's a very interesting book. It puts to bed the idea that fascism is capitalism in decay on the first page, which is kind of nice. So I enjoy it for that. But it's written by like a German historian who's not really.
Well, what kind of German historian?
I guess he investigates the Nazis, but
he's very interested in Nazi ideology, I guess.
But it's a good book though. We can talk about it another time. Let's see.
Yeah, sure, bud.
What's the next? Oh, okay.
I'll just answer by saying I hate communism, so that's why I hate fascists just as much as tankies.
I mean, same here, man. Same here. This is an insult towards both of you. This next super chat. Okay.
Let's go.
Okay.
This is the most boring debate about economics informed morality ever. These two barely disagree with each other.
Yeah, Fabian and I are two peas in a pod, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, luckily it didn't get into policing, which is what Econoboi's specialty is to bog down any conversation with an ANCAP about policing for the entire time.
Well, any market, any sort of, I don't want to say stated market, but I mean, policing is just a classic example. Like military could be another one, or like stuff like that, right? Where, it's a big question for, and we talked about it earlier, like a big question for like average people on the street when it comes to anarchism is like, but what about police? I think that's a pretty decent initial explainer for most people when it comes to anarchism.
I don't know. I think that might actually be a case where you lose some efficiency and then you gain more universal coverage, and that might be a fair trade-off.
Maybe,
sure. That's what I personally think, anyway. I guess there's only one more question left. If the NAP is dead, can I eat it? I don't know. I don't know. That's it.
I don't know, man.
I think the fact that Fabian and I contributed labor to your stream means that we're entitled to 1/3 of all the super chats from this stream.
I mean, if you want.
We produce the product.
There's not many today. So, listen, if you want 25 Canadian dollars each, I can send it over. There's not much on this. This has been
good.
One of the quieter streams today.
Canadian money isn't even good for making a fire. It's all plastic.
True. You know what?
Can you even burn Canadian money? It's literally fucking plastic.
My chat actually has a response to that last super chat, which is answer. You cannot eat it because if the NAP is dead, then you live in a communist country.
Oh, fair enough.
Which means you're starving to death. Yeah.
Yep. You can't eat it. You would have already ate it long ago, and now it's gone.
You're working on shoe leather right now.
Okay, I think that's it. There's a few super chats directed to me personally that are not about this stream, so I'll answer those after the call. So thanks for being here, guys. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
No, I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me. I haven't been able to branch off into the YouTube space very much. For whatever reason, it's difficult to make that bridge from like Twitch to YouTube because the communities kind of don't know each other that well, And my YouTube channel is like absurdly small. It's just like interviews, but if you want to check out a bunch of interviews or whatever, check out Fabian Liberty on YouTube and some of the debates. Yeah.
Oh, Jesus. Right at the end, $50. Thank you, dude. Capitalism wins again. Yes.
Always.
So,
hopefully.
Yes, chat. make sure to check out both Econoboi, who I've had on many times, and check out Fabian Liberty as well. I might actually branch into Twitch at some point. I don't know. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah.
YouTube's
You just got
great, but
you don't like, the problem is like the video essayist gets to like, you know, you have the luxury of like putting in a bunch of research and putting out one video, whereas me, like, in order to maintain my audience and everything, I'm going to be streaming probably for like the next 5 or 6 hours after this, because that's just like what to like grow a healthy Twitch requires is constant streaming.
Yeah.
Just dual stream, Dev. I mean, what's wrong with dual streaming?
It's against the affiliate contract.
Ah, fuck it, I don't care.
Well, it's because you have YouTube.
You know, the affiliate, right?
Right, exactly. You're a YouTuber. You can be like, fuck it. What happens if I get banned? I don't care.
Yeah. I mean, I do have an affiliate Twitch, but like I don't make my money there. I make it here, you know, so I don't care, I guess. So I mean, I could, and if I get banned, I get banned. It's like whatever, you know. A few months of Jeff Bezos bucks is nice. That's about it.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. And you know, if you ever want to chit chat or whatever and not go into deep theory or stuff, you know, we can. I can be relaxing and entertaining too. So hit me up whenever.
Sure.
Yeah, it's always fun, guys.
Yeah, I'll see you guys later.
You just watched a clip from our Twitch channel, Fabian Liberty. If you like content like this, please like and subscribe here on YouTube, or go ahead and give us a follow on twitch.tv/Fabian Liberty.